particular zone. Its water is gone forever. So it's just the icing in between the layers of the cake. So that's the way subsidence works. In fact, interestingly, that you mentioned that, that'll be part of the third session. For those, I'm sorry, who are not going to be here, but I'll be talking about contemporary issues and the subsidence out in western Madera and Merced County. I have some slides to show where it is. It doesn't reflect that, because I can't look down underneath myself and find out where it's occurring. In central Madera County, about 300 to 350 feet below the surface, which doesn't sound like a whole heck of a lot, but in geology time, it's pretty darn deep and pretty old. So, yeah. But the drop has been fairly dramatic in a couple of places, and like I said, I'll show that. More questions?
Is corn still grown in the Central Valley by flooding fields?
Yes, corn is still grown by flood irrigation in some places here in the valley. And a lot of it has to do with either the water rights. Some districts are better off than others, and so they can still afford to irrigate corn using flood irrigation. Another thing is that, believe it or not, what's known as flood irrigation using dead level basin irrigation is actually very efficient. In fact, it can be more efficient even than sprinklers. What it is that if you have a sufficient enough, what they call head, the amount of water that can flow out of a pipe very quickly, and I had this out in my irrigation district, they moved it over so quickly, so fast, they could just put in on a couple of inches on, and then it would percolate and satisfy the crop, the corn. So if so there's a specific irrigation method. The other reason why corn is grown and they use flood irrigation is in some areas it helps with groundwater recharge. Because if your corn is grown on the east side over a sandy soil and you have to irrigate frequently because it percolates so fast, a lot of frequent irrigations using flood irrigation then help recharge the groundwater. So it's like I said in the first session, everything about water is location, location, location. It just doesn't make sense to see or hear that people are flood irrigating, but you have to know the specific circumstances to be able to understand whether or not it's rational in that particular place.
You can't really grow corn without flood irrigation, can you?
You know what? Just like everything else, yes. Oh, drip tape. Drip tape with GPS tractors, you can do just about anything because the tractor knows where the tape is, and if you have to cultivate in between the rows, the tractor will go in between the rows and miss the drip tape. If the drip tape is on either side of the corn stalk and dripping the right amount of water down in there with the right amount of fertilizer, it will do just fine. So drip tape has been a revolution in terms of precision application and conserving water here in the San Joaquin Valley. So pretty soon you'll be seeing tractors driving around with nobody inside. They're really, they'll run by themselves. They know exactly where they are with the GPS. The hard part has been the turns. And frankly, the current crop of tractor drivers don't always know how to turn either. So anyway, that was always a problem because tractor driving is boring. And I can remember my guys saying, oh, the tractor driver fell asleep, you know, and he goes through a barn or runs over to something else. Sir?
There's an opportunity for Google with its driverless cars.
Exactly. Yeah. Question?
Would you explain tape irrigation?
Drip tape. Okay. I wish I had a piece. We have some over at the farm. And we use it here now on the campus. What it is, it's a tube that's kind of flattened, okay? And then it has orifices on the bottom side. And so they're designed to allow so much water per hole in each part of the drip tape. And whether or not it's permanent or semi-permanent or just 1 year depends on the thickness of the plastic, okay? So the thicker it is, the longer it'll last. They have now drip tape that'll go over 20 years. And they have some that you just go back through the field and incorporate it into the field the next year. You don't even have to bother about picking it back up again. Sometimes you'll see them, they'll roll it up. You'll see it at the end of the fields. It's all rolled up. Well, they wanted to till, and they didn't have the right kind of tape in, so they have to go put it back out in there. In some cases, older tape will do that. So now, it just depends on what your financial circumstances are, what crop you're growing, whatever you want to do. The drip tape is pretty adapted. Now, the question is with that kind of a precision, those little holes, how do they manage to keep them from plugging up? Yeah. Oh, their corn what? Oh, the irrigation of the corn? Well, it has been flood irrigated, quite frankly. And a lot depends on where it's irrigated, but I think we're going to try drip as well on the corn. So I don't know, we'll see. They'll probably do some trials this year. I've got to talk to the farm manager, Mike Broski. I don't know what their plans are. We're scrambling this year here on the farm, just like everybody else. The drought has impacted us. And by the way, I have mentioned that droughts, we're in a 3-year drought. Actually, if you calculated it, we're in a 7 or 8 year drought because we had one wet year in 2010, 2011, but you go back to 2006 was when we had the last wet year. So 7 out of 8 the last years have been very dry. So it's actually probably then an 8-year drought. And this is the way it went in the 88 to 94 drought. 76, 77 was the last big one. That was the worst until we're not sure how this one's going to finish up. We're still calculating that, I think, to figure out where we're going to end up on the time continuum of droughts on an annual basis. But 76, 77 actually had bracketed by some pretty wet years, so that one was a little bit different. So anyway, is anybody who was not here last time, do I need to do a quick refresher? You, sir. What we went through last time was, and this is going to be a really quick tour. We went through what we're going to do. We talked about the foundation and history, and today is session 2, California's water system, surface and groundwater location and development, and then the last session will be the contemporary issues. But obviously, we just open it up and start talking about things. Like today, did anybody see the front page? Uh-huh, okay. The San Joaquin River popped up this year as the most endangered river in the country right now, okay? But last year was the Colorado. Well, interestingly enough, I've got that in the discussion today. We talk a little bit about that. I'll show you the Colorado system and the San Joaquin to some extent and why they're in trouble, or what is it about them that gives them that moniker. But going back to what you missed, basically we talked about where water occurs in California. Most of it's in the north. Most of the population is in the south. And we talked about water rights. How we got where we are is based on who came here first and how they established the system. And so we went through that fairly quickly, but not too quickly. A very important couple of gentlemen from here in the San Joaquin Valley were Miller and Lux, started the water rights on the San Joaquin River, which we'll talk more about then today. They are the senior most water rights holders in the valley. Modesto Irrigation District, Turlock Irrigation District, they're right up there as well. And this is how they built canals in the old days. Yes, sir.
Greg has first session's handout?
Yes, it's in that package.
Oh, okay, thanks.
It's in there. So we went to groundwater rights and all these other things. That a lot of the water development started privately. Corporations, land developers, agriculturalists, all kinds of different people started private enterprise. What really kicked off all of the water delivery systems that were in the last part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century until the Wright Act came along in 1887, and then that organized public water districts. And by the way, most water delivered today is delivered by a public agency, including the city of Fresno, city of Clovis. There are over 490 public water agencies in California, and they deliver over 90% of the water that's used. Okay, dams and hydropower is kind of where we left off, and this is where we are today. The rise of the dam builders. Yes? Oh, keep the sand and everything. I got diverted, sorry. I did. You know, the sand is done by expensive filtration, but it's a major problem. In fact, we're working with some irrigation districts right now because they're starting to see people, instead of trying to use ditch water, are using groundwater, because groundwater is naturally filtered. It comes out with very low particles, okay? Unless your well is sanding up because it's collapsing down below and you're sucking the sand up and it'll tear up your pump and everything, then you're in trouble. But for the most part, wells, especially large production wells, have enough filtration and everything, and the size of the screen and all that stops the sand from getting into the well, into the water, and they hook their drip systems up to those directly. And what's happened, especially in the Sacramento Valley, is that they have reduced the amount of ditch water that they use, and now the irrigation companies and districts are saying, what are we going to do? So they've asked us to help them find better filtration systems for ditch water, because you'll see out in the fields out there in the country those round stainless steel things, those are sand filters, trying to knock out the particles that will plug the drip tape. And they're mostly successful, but if the water is dirty, like ditch water, the backwash is over and over and over again, and they're actually losing water. They have to figure out a way how to recapture that and bring it back into the system so that it won't plug up the tape. The other thing they do is they have injection ports, okay? They'll literally have injection capability where they can inject the fertilizers, or they can inject in things like algicides, because one of the other big problems, if you let water get stagnant for very long here, you know what happened to a swimming pool after a couple of weeks without chlorine, starts turning green. That's airborne algae particles. It'll just come right out of the atmospheric deposition. Algae is attached to small, very fine dust particles that we're all dealing with APCD, the Air Pollution Control Districts. One of the things is PM 2.5, particle material less than 2.5 microns. An algae is small enough, some of the spores, it'll even attach to that material, and when it settles out and it goes into your swimming pool, it'll turn it green. Algicides, so they use chemicals. Might be chlorine, same thing you put in your pool, but there might be other materials that they try to use. And then the last thing is if they're in trouble with chemical precipitation. Our water is hard. The white stuff on the faucets and everything is calcium carbonate, calcium materials. Well, it will deposit on a small little hole too and start to plug it up, so they will inject acids as well. Some of them organic acids, some of them strong chemical acids. And so, which actually helps the soil in some cases too, because if you've got salt accumulation or something, they're actually using the chemical in a dose that will help improve water infiltration. One of the problems with heavily salinized soils is if it's sodium like table salt, it causes the clays to come apart and seal the soil over. And so by adding acids, they can reopen the soil back up so that the water will penetrate to the root zone of the plants. So a lot of soil chemistry there. That was one of the things I had to learn. A lot of soil chemistry. Okay, we done with drip tape? It's cool.
Our soil in general tends to be more alkaline.
Yes, our soil in the valley, we're in a dry area. And when Mother Nature laid down those soils, some of them, especially on the west side, came with natural sea salts. That was part of the ocean bed that was ripped up. The geologic theory is tectonic plates, right? The Pacific plate is running into the continental plate, bent everything, twisted it up. So when you go out there and you see those zones, some of those were seabeds. So when they erode down from rainfall over there, they redissolved those salts and they brought them out into the valley floor. And that was part of the early development things, and that's why they wanted surface water. That's another reason why they wanted to bring water from Northern California, because it was low in salts. Even the groundwater out there has enough of a natural salt burden, including sodium salts, that would just aggravate the problem that they already had with these fine clays out there. And so between putting in tile drainage, bringing in fresh water, they were able to redissolve and move most of those soil salts back down deep enough or out of the soil that they could actually grow pretty good crops. So salinity is a major problem. I've got lots of maps on salinity as well as the sodium hazard, not for today though. Rise of the dam builders. At the latter part of the 19th century, There was already a lot of dams under construction, and we mentioned a couple of them last time. One of them was Miller and Lux out in the Mendota Pool, and then they built a canal and diverted the water over 100 miles from Fresno County up to Stanislaus County. A lot of the other development was in Southern California. It was starting to grow in terms of both agriculture and population. You remember, Southern California, up until the 1950s, Los Angeles County was the #1 county for agriculture in the country. And it was because of citrus and truck vegetables and crops that they could grow on those nice soils that they had down there from both the LA River Basin Plain and the Santa Ana River in Orange County. And there's hardly any oranges left in Southern California. There's a couple of legacy orchards in the Inland Empire up around Redlands and San Bernardino and Riverside. But, well, even in the heart of Orange County, there's still some vestiges of irrigated agriculture. I may have mentioned last time, Secretary of Agriculture Kawamura from the Orange County area under the Schwarzenegger administration farms and still farms down there growing vegetables and things with his family. And so there are still some people down there, but for the most part, the changeover was really to serve the growing population. And so they started building some dams in Southern California. And here's one, the world's first arch-type dam. If you think of dams today, you think of some place like Hoover Dam. You drive over there, this great big massive concrete thing, but it is a thin arch dam. It goes from pretty thick at the bottom though, and then gets thinner as it goes to the top. Well, this was the first one. It was built in Southern California. Gentleman by the name of Frank Brown, and he became president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And that was the first Big Bear Lake down there in the San Bernardino Mountains. Looks pretty crude right there, but it worked. So, first thin arch dam in the whole country, and then the grandfather to all of the big dams, whether it's Grand Coulee, Glen Canyon, Hoover, all of the western dams built by the Bureau of Reclamation or the Corps of Engineers that ended up using the thin arch type. Not all of them did. Some of them are what they call fat dams, which are earth-filled, like San Luis Reservoir. You drive over there, it's just gravel-faced, right? Well, it's an earth-filled dam, which have the ability to flex, by the way. In fact, there was one in this list that has withstood the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco and did fine, and it was the one that holds back Crystal Springs Reservoir. You ever been up on Highway 280 going over there? The original bottom dam. It's been replaced and rebuilt a couple of times just for the sake of improving the amount of water behind that dam to get more in there. It was rebuilt, but the original dam withstood, didn't fail. It just shook with the ground and stayed there.
That surface looks awfully rough. Is that concrete?
My guess is it was bags of concrete. You know what you do? You fill up a bag and then you wet it and you stick it on and do it bit by bit. That's what my guess is that they did there. I don't know. I did not go into the research on finding out what it was that they used to build that dam, but that's what it looks like to me. I don't know. It seems to me that would still be pretty weak, that you wouldn't have any way of, maybe it was, they built it out of boxes, and the boxes were bent or something and filled them one by one and were building it across. I don't know. That's it. Cyclopean masonry. Built of cyclopean masonry. Masonry, okay, we know that's concrete, right? But other than that, that's what it is. You're absolutely right. So, first dam. So then we get to the era in the early 20th century where we start building regional, state, and federal projects. But still today, this is the summation of where we are, and then I'll go into the details of each one. This is where we are today. Starting with the development all the way up on the Shasta and Trinity Rivers where it's part of the federal projects. The orange is the local Colorado River, a lot of green. Look at this still. Remember how we say the whole thing started? Still 55% of the water delivered from these projects is local, 55%. The Colorado River is only 7, federal projects 11, state 4%. Groundwater actually ranges from 23 to 42, depending on the year type. That's what's, remember I said that there's no such thing as average in California. And this is a perfect example again this year. It seems like we're either in floods or droughts. There's very few years, but this is what generally we get out of our water supply in California. Average applied water does not include reuse or recycling. Quantities vary by year. That should have been big, bold right there. So, what are these projects and why are they important and where are they? The first one I'm going to talk about is this one right here. It's another quote, you don't mind the pun, watershed event. That is the All-American Canal and the Coachella Valley Canals. And that is the Imperial Valley and the Coachella Valley. Palm Springs, up here in the Imperial Valley is south of the Salton Sea. Alamo River is a river that is one of the old braided channels. Actually, it was partly constructed. The first diversion off the Colorado River of any consequence was by Imperial Irrigation District in the Imperial Valley, and it's senior to everybody on the Colorado River. It's the #1 user in the whole Colorado River system. And it diverted on its own diversion structure that it built in Mexico, way down here further, and then it came across and worked its way back up, and there was this channel that was actually, it was a drain that came in because the Salton Sea is below sea level. This desert valley is very, very low. And they built that canal in the late 19th century and started diverting water and started irrigating in this area and earned some senior water rights on the Colorado River against all the other appropriators and riparianists in the western states. 1905, it blew out. It was not constructed of firm material, and there was a flood on the Colorado River, and they lost control of the Alamo River, and it created the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea is a man-made feature. It was not natural in the area. And now it's one of the big environmental fights in California because what happened was it became an important part of the Pacific Flyway. It's a resting and nesting area for birds. And so it's shrinking because water conservation and an exchange with San Diego has created a situation where they're delivering less water to the farms in the Imperial Valley. So that will be one of the issues I'll talk a little bit about to conclude that in the last session. But the important thing is that it blew out and the United States came to the rescue. The United States in 1902, the government had a new law. It was the 1902 Reclamation Act that formalized the Federal Bureau of Reclamation and gave them the charge of irrigating the West. That was the main charge of the United States Bureau of Reclamation under the Reclamation Act. And the idea was to get people a 160-acre farm in the West. In fact, it limited people to 160 acres because at the time they thought under the economy that a person could make a living for his family on 160 acres. So the Reclamation Act established the Bureau of Reclamation and the laws about allowing water to be used that was captured by the federal government under whatever licenses and rights they could obtain from the states. And that then kicked off the building of all of the projects on the Colorado River. So that's why I say this was kind of a watershed. And what they did was they built a dam first over here on the Colorado River called Imperial Reservoir and Imperial Dam, one of their first projects, and created what's now known as the All-American Canal. And it was named that because it no longer went through Mexico. It was through here, all along the southern border. Later on, this part of the area started to grow, and it was found that they had some beneficial soils to grow crops up there as well. In fact, half of the Coachella Valley still is in intense agriculture. A lot of crops come out of that area as well, vegetables and things, lettuce. And so they added on the Coachella Valley Canal. Uh-huh. Yep, Teddy Roosevelt. Absolutely. The nation's first conservationist president, a Republican. he started the national parks, the Bureau of Reclamation. A lot of things happened at this particular time. Remember, there was this tension that I talked about politically between the monopolists and you remember what was it we learned in Upton Sinclair and the problem with the food industry and the slaughter industry and everything. So there was this progressive movement to change the way we were doing business and go after the monopolists, and it affected a lot of them. I mentioned Miller and Lux last time. They were broken up. They were hit with tremendous tax levies, and the successors to Henry Miller had to sell off a whole bunch of land to keep up with the federal government when all of that started happening. So the government was getting very active in the overall business of water in particular. So Alamo River and the American diverted Colorado River, but the IID ended up with pre-1914 water rights, and the failure created the Salton Sea, and the Bureau of Reclamation formed. So, all right, now we're going to go to the next batch of projects, starting with earlier. The next outfit that started to get very active was Los Angeles. Town was growing, needed a water supply, exhausted the capacity of small dams like Big Bear in the Southland, needed to go far and wide to figure out where to get water. It was a combination of both population pressure but land speculation as well. And in fact, the Los Angeles Aqueduct was built in 1908. It went up into the Owens Valley, up here on the backside of the Sierra, and there's this fresh water off of granite mountains. And as opposed to the Coast Range, granite doesn't add much in the way of minerals to the water at all. It's so low in salinity in some cases that the water perfectly beads up even on soil and won't penetrate very well. There's a phenomenon, if you put a bead of water, it'll form a bead on a very flat, shiny surface like glass, and the soils are quartz glass, and so it won't go. So it's excellent water quality. It came off the backside of the streams, off the top from the snow melt that ran down the other side of the Sierra. So it ran from west to east into that river system. However, it is fairly dry on that side. The Owens Valley is a desert. And it had created a number of lakes, Mono Lake, Owens Lake, and a couple of other small puddles, and they did get fairly mineralized because they cooked over time. So they did dry out, and there were a lot of salts. In fact, Mono Lake, talk about later, a very famous decision when it started to dry too much, it made a land bridge between the shore and an island in the center, a cone island, and that's what resulted in predators going in and attacking some of the birds in that area. The famous person who involved himself in this effort is a man by the name of William Mulholland. And Mr. Mulholland is also famous because a movie was made about all of that, the land speculators and all of the dirty politics and dealing going on. A movie called Chinatown. You remember the movie Chinatown with Jack Nicholson? Mr. Mulholland was one of the characters in that, and he infamously said when the project was built and the water was delivered here, "There it is, take it." That was Mr. Mulholland's claim to fame in terms of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is the successor organization now, and they still operate that system, but because of environmental decisions, and I'll show this a little while, they have had to give back a lot of water, and so it's not a major source. It is a major source, but not nearly as it used to be in the 20th century. Question?
Maybe a little bit of a diversion, but I noticed that big pipe there.
Yeah,
I'm wondering,
riveted, bolted.
have there ever been any negotiations between California and, say, the Northwest to bring water down?
Oh, all the time. Myriad of proposals to bring Columbia River water, Canadian water. It's always about the politics and the cost. At some point in time, we'll be in desperate enough straits that you and I or our successors or grandkids will pay to bring water from that area because Canada, frankly, is the richest area in the world for fresh water. Even better than Russia and Siberia and all of that. It has the most fresh water of any of the nations in the world. The Canadians take a little issue with us trying to buy their water sometimes as well, and under the nationalist attitude. But yes, there have been a multitude of, because you could probably divert way up on the border in between the Rockies where the Columbia is and get it through and get it around the backside of the Rockies through the Great Basin area and somehow get it into California. But boy, would it be expensive. But there's also been proposals to bring icebergs all the way down and try and barges full of water from our own state of Alaska. Alaska has quite a bit of water, although that's in contention these days as well because we want to maintain the salmon fishery worldwide, and that's one of the last vestiges of good natural salmon habitat. So the question or another day. Los Angeles Aqueduct, William Mulholland, 1908. Hetch Hetchy is the next one, 1913. San Francisco was growing. In fact, it's amazing. San Francisco and Los Angeles have always been in competition with each other, it seems like, for one thing or another. Water was no different. What they had to do, because Teddy Roosevelt, we already dropped that little gem in here, had created national parks, and Yosemite was the first big national park, right? Yellowstone came on a little bit later. So Hetch Hetchy is within the boundaries of Yosemite National Park. So it was designated as a wilderness, right? So San Francisco and its politicians had to go to Washington, D.C. and get special legislation and go through a big old battle and give up a whole lot of other things in terms of what other people wanted in laws and stuff. You know how the things work with a proverbial, what do they call it? Omnibus bill that has everything, a pork bill, okay? Well, they got it. It's called the Raker Act of 1913. And they started constructing, and what they built then on the Tuolumne River up in Yosemite Valley was a tunnel that goes all the way then to Sunol. There's a famous garden and special facility in the Sunol Valley, which is between Livermore and the Bay Area, Fremont. And then brought it all the way over, and then there's those reservoirs up there in the crack between the hills there in the San Francisco Peninsula, and Crystal Springs is one of them. And so that's how they got their water. Interestingly enough, what they did was bypass then water from the Delta watershed. And we'll talk about more of that in the last session. Just another little teaser there. So San Francisco ended up with their storage reservoir. And by the way, that is kind of a bathtub ring, even though granite does not give up much in the way of minerals. There still is some staining. Water is a universal solvent. And so you can see on the slide that there's a ring around the tub of some redissolution and then reprecipitation. The salts have bleached out essentially the rock in that particular zone. So that was obviously taken in a dry year when it has been drawn down quite a bit.
Does that water exclusively go to San Francisco?
You know, it goes to the whole Bay Area. Yeah. When San Francisco built it, they included other areas, including a substantial portion of the peninsula itself and some East Bay organizations as well. And in fact, it's so complicated now, there's all kinds of different exchanges and everything between a lot of the entities over in there. If you give us Hetch Hetchy, we'll give you State Water Project water, because the State Water Project goes all the way to Livermore. There's Del Val Reservoir. So it gets really complicated and hard, but you're absolutely right. San Francisco paid for it. San Francisco Public Utilities operates it, but then they have these exchanges and things where they sell water to other people on a retail or wholesale basis, including cities. Question? Well, the story is that John Muir was living in the Bay Area at the time, and he literally cried. You know, he's the father of the conservation movement and was so upset about losing that particular valley. I mean, he just went into despair. So it was a very, very political thing with tension. And like I said, somehow it was resolved with politics because the East Coast still dominated then and dominates now politics. So my recollection is they got something out of the deal, and that was enough to get the votes. welcome to California water. Remember, everything is local. 55% is local. So when anybody mentions rediverting the water from Hetch Hetchy and getting it back into the river system, Senator Feinstein gets a little upset from what I understand. And I've been around her when she gets mad. She's not very vocal. She's not hesitant to tell you in blunt words, don't touch it. So it's still about political. Absolutely, it's core to the Bay Area, and for a couple of reasons. Not only do they get the water supply for drinking water, which they would have to replace somehow, which some could argue that they could join the diverters and in the delta, at the edge of the delta, and probably get the same amount of water. There might be some losses in the Stanislaus, or excuse me, the San Joaquin, lower San Joaquin, but so there would have to be a political deal done. But the other thing that they get that's very important to them is power. Hetch Hetchy Dam has a powerhouse on it, and that supplies the city of San Francisco with a substantial part of its portfolio, somewhere around 30%. They're trying to go green. They're buying solar farms and all kinds of stuff all over the place, but it is a very important, so it's got a double whammy there. They get the power from it as well as the drinking water supply. There was another question.
I thought there was a little history that in terms of Yosemite, that the state of California was involved in administering or running.
That's what happened. Yosemite, you're right. Yosemite actually was started by the state of California, and the state was practically bankrupt and turned it over to the federal government. And there's some shenanigans then. This was, I think, was all part of that to finalize the boundary. The setup of Yosemite National Park. And I'm not exactly sure. I think Yosemite was pretty much taken over by the feds about this time, but there was that interplay over time. So there was a lot going on because it doesn't happen overnight. You're right. But the state had failed miserably in setting it up, didn't have the money to run it and all that. And so then the national law took over and the feds took it over. So yeah, so it's a lot more complicated. We could spend days on some of this stuff. It's just not practical at this point to give you the big picture. The next one was the McCollum Aqueduct. And the McCollum River is another tributary of the San Joaquin River. There are a number. Starts with, of course, the San Joaquin. And believe it or not, that's Buchanan, and that's, well, no, maybe, that's the flood bypass. That's the San Joaquin. That's Lake Millerton. There's a couple of little ones up here in Madera, and they occasionally will flood and tie in over here. But the major ones are the San Joaquin. This is the Kings, and the Kings only gets in there by choice instead of it flooding the Tulare Lake. The lake bed people don't want the water, so there's a specific diversion of 4,750 cubic feet per second in wet years that goes out here first. Anything above that, then it does have to go down into ancient Tulare Lake. So the Kings is connected physically in wet years, but it's man-made. There's the diversion structures that make it go to the north. It naturally would go into the lake bed. And then the San Joaquin, and that's the flood channel, the East Side Bypass, Chowchilla Bypass. The next one, of course, then is the Tuolumne, Merced rather, the Tuolumne, the Stanislaus, and then the McCollum is up here. The last one that gets in is the Calaveras. In fact, I think that's the McCollum, and that's the Calaveras. Yeah, or the Calaveras and the Cosumnes, excuse me. Calaveras and the Cosumnes. The Cosumnes goes into there, goes into the McCollum, goes into the San Joaquin. Anyway, McCollum Aqueduct. And that was built for East Bay. So San Francisco had theirs, so, well, we're going to get ours. And so that goes into Oakland, and the East Bay Municipal Utility District operates the McCollum Aqueduct. Interesting thing about it, it goes through the heart of the delta. So when islands flood in the delta, and that happened in 2005, Roberts Island went under for no particular reason. Their pipeline was inundated as well as natural gas, the railroad, Highway 4. That's a problem. They go right through the heart of the delta and they have to maintain that thing. And so they have expanded their portfolio to do a number of things, including make exchanges on the American. Anyway, McCollum was a very important project for the growth of the East Bay from Oakland, San Leandro, San Lorenzo, Richmond, all of that area. And just like we talked about San Francisco, it's integrated in some respects with some of the other communities in there. So the communities are spotty. One might be a Hetch Hetchy customer, one might be an East Bay Mud customer. And then they also buy, some of them in the East Bay are also a State Water Project customer. Colorado River Aqueduct is the next big one, 1932. Los Angeles still didn't have enough water, even with Los Angeles Aqueduct going to the city of Los Angeles, to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. They formed a new agency called the Metropolitan Water District, MWD, in Southern California to serve the rest of Southern California. And I have some slides on this, but MWD actually goes like this and goes all the way and serves San Diego. Another interesting thing about the Colorado River water and the aqueduct, goes through the desert. Goes over here, a bunch of pumping stations. It does get a little bit of gravity flow, but they burn a lot of power to get that water over here into Lake Matthews and to service then all of the communities that are hooked up to Metropolitan Water District. It came after Imperial, after the other, but it still has pretty good water rights. The other thing about the Colorado River is it's salty. The water is very salty. It's much like I talked about the Coast Range impacting water quality coming out of this area and impacting the soils. A lot of the basin of the Colorado is very erosive and contains a lot of salt, and so the water has a quite high salt level. It's calcium, though. It's hard water. And that is one of the reasons why they bring in state water from the State Water Project from Lake Shasta, because they're able to blend the two. In fact, I had a conversation the other day with somebody who said, if we don't get Northern California water, some of our agencies, when they discharge out of their wastewater treatment plant, when you take in Colorado River water, you use it, some of it evaporates, it gets to the wastewater plant. The wastewater plant has to put it someplace, and some of them discharge into the Santa Ana River, for example. It's too salty in the discharge, and they're a violation of a state permit. So unless they have some water from someplace else to dilute it down, they could be in trouble with the state and automatically get fines and everything else of violating the Clean Water Act, because the water starts out too salty and they have objectives for the river, and it doesn't meet those receiving water objectives, and they're in violation of the federal law. Sir?
When we divert water, like in this aqueduct, the Colorado River flows into Mexico. I understand it's just a trickle now. Do we have to negotiate with Mexico, or is it as we often have?
Absolutely. Absolutely, there's a treaty. There is a treaty. I'll get into that because I'm going to go into the specifics of 2 case studies. I'm going to go in much more detail on the Colorado River because of its importance to this state, and the Delta. So that'll be in a future slide where I'll discuss that. How are we doing for time? Got to keep moving here. Okay. MWD, 1932, and served Southern California. Big project. Here. Oh, we get to start talking about it. You just brought it right into right here. Here's how it works. The Colorado River Aqueduct to Metropolitan Water Service, the Colorado River Aqueduct gives 0.7 million acre feet, and 1 acre foot, 1 million acre foot is about a foot deep on a football field. Go to Bulldog Stadium, fill it up 1 foot on the lines around there, and that's an acre foot. So it'll serve an acre of land with 12 inches of water. So the football field is about an acre. So they got 750,000 of those from the Colorado River. Their local supplies, all those little dams and all that other stuff that I talked about, this is 2007, adds up to 2 million acre feet. It is still by far their largest source is the locals. They have enough off the transverse range, the San Bernardino Mountains, and the, what's the other range? I forget temporarily. I know it, but senior moment. And then the Los Angeles Aqueduct right now is only delivering about 200,000 acre feet because of a change in the rules under a lawsuit. A State Water Project brings in 1.2 million acre feet when they get it. This year, 0 out of what they want. And That's their portfolio for delivering water to 20+ million people, right? I think that's the service area. You bring in the rest of the Inland Empire and over the hill in Palmdale, Lancaster, what was it, 23 million down there now? We're 38 total, something like that. So that's what they rely on for their water. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, you're right. They're going to deliver what they call hardship water, but their contractual entitlement is zero. And what they do is they peel back to what they call the Health and Safety Code, a constitutional amount of water, and that hasn't been determined yet. Yes, they can get some water out of the State Water Project, but under their contract, because they have to treat everybody equally, under the contract relationship they have with both ag and the cities, they start out at zero like everybody else, and then they end up negotiating on this constitutional requirement. And that's going to be a combination of the State Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board. I don't think it's figured out yet because they were waiting for the final snow survey, right, and a lot of other information to put into the formulas to figure out how to give them essentially hardship or basic human needs water. So 0 is the number to start with, and we're still waiting for a number. I was going to get into that, but you prompted me sooner. So anyway, this is the way the Colorado River is apportioned. Remember I said Imperial Irrigation District was one of the first major diverters. And California then gets 4.4 million acre feet out of the Colorado system. Of that, remember how much MWD got was 0.7. The rest is IID, Coachella, and the other users. So the ag users down here were the senior most rights, and they have first in time rights then to the Colorado River system. Arizona, because of all the tributaries, the Gila and the Republican and all the other rivers in Arizona contribute, and so they end up with 2.8 million. Little portion of New Mexico, you get a little bit. Colorado was second diverter after California. They started building projects fairly early. They take water from the west side of the Front Range, and they've drilled through and deliver a lot of the water to the east side of the Front Range. So Denver and a lot of those areas actually get Colorado River water, even though it's on the other side and the drainage basin goes this way. And then Wyoming has Flaming Gorge and the Green River, which is a pretty good source. And then Utah, between the Huintas and the other drainages that come in from this direction and get into the Colorado, they ended up with 1.71. And that's all part of the Colorado Compact. Question, back in the back, and then there. Absolutely. It is divided up proportionally based on the available flow. And there's a bunch of metrics that they use to do that. And it's the height in Lake Mead, the Lake Powell. But always California is number one first. We get ours. But there is a proportionality process that they have. So it works. The Bureau of Reclamation. Yeah. The Bureau built most of the projects. And so that's how they ended up as the water master for the river. But there's also a great association. The compact itself has an association of all the western states that are part of the Colorado, and they participate actively. Obviously, they're trying to protect their own interests, so there's some rules on the compact. Yes?
Quick question, when you talk about Colorado River apportionment, you're talking about all the tributaries that flow into it?
Yep, there they are.
Okay.
That is the Colorado River Basin. Okay? So, like I said, that's the Gila. I think that's the Republican, but don't quote me on that. And then here's Lake Powell and Glen Canyon. Big, huge facility, Lake Mead, obviously. And then here's the upper Colorado, the Little Colorado and Green River out of Utah, the Huinta. I can't remember the name of all the rivers. But that is the Colorado River Basin. Covers a big part of the West. And, of course, this is named after John Wesley Powell, the gentleman who, one of the first officers of the United States who was an engineer and a surveyor who surveyed a lot of this area. And of course, his recommendation back when he completed his report and sent it to Washington was that the states should be based, the boundaries based on the watershed, because water would be the most compelling issue facing the statehood and the economies of those western states when and if they did get added to the Union. Of course, he was ignored, but he turned out to be extremely prophetic in terms of his idea. Sir?
Another question, on those lakes in the desert, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, do they know how much they lose through evaporation?
Oh boy, do they ever. Everything is measured very carefully. They know, and they do have tremendous losses to evaporation with those large systems. The good thing about them is they're very deep and narrow, so the surface area isn't that great, but the climate is such that absolutely they lose a lot of water evaporation. In fact, there's a lot of technology that's being looked at right now. I'm meeting with a gentleman this afternoon is going to talk about evaporative control chemicals. I went to Israel to an international water show a number of years ago, and the Danes had come up with plastic little puzzle pieces. They're shaped like a tinker toy, not tinker toy, what was it, jacks. They're shaped like jacks. You throw them into the pond, and they automatically adjust to themselves and fit into each other and create a floating evaporative cover. Works very well in small things, but could you see how many it'd take to cover Lake Mead? It'd take the whole federal treasury to figure out how to, in 1 year, to put enough of those things on a reservoir. So we have, and then the chemicals are polymers that expand and they'll float and they're white, and so they reflect the light back. So evaporation is a big issue, but it's uneconomical in most cases for the larger reservoirs. It's all part of the compact and the calculations every year. They figure out how much they've lost. They would like to have that water back, but think of this, though. It also changes the climate in those areas. You get a little evaporative cooling. Why do you think boating and houseboating is so popular on Lake Mead? You go back in some of those canyons were shady, and you get a little evaporative cooling. So it might be 105 in Vegas, and it's probably only 100 on Lake Mead. Yeah, cold. Oh, okay, so these are some of the agencies then that also divert Colorado River water. MWD, here's obviously, there's other lakes down below Mead. There's Lake Mojave, Lake Havasu, Havasu City, and gambling joints, what is it? I forget. Laughlin, yeah, down here in Lake Mojave. So there's their canal, goes to IEID, there's the All-American Canal again, Coachella Valley Water District, Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and LA Water Power gets theirs there. So that is the watershed again, and that was the division up by the states. And this is kind of the record that we're faced with on Lake Mead.
On that last slide, you had a red dot, went across there, cuts it from Utah to New Mexico. What's that?
That's it. See, the states have that are in the upper basin. They're the area of origin of all of the water. The lower basin are where the rivers discharge eventually and go all the way out to the Gulf of California out through Mexico. And Mexico is part then. There's not on here, 1.5 million acre feet to irrigate below the border. That is part of the treaty that we started to talk about. I briefly forgot. Upper basin is where a lot of the watersheds are. We have the same issue here in California. The Sierra people who live in the Sierra feel ignored in many instances, that all of the snowmelt and the stored water in the soils wherever they are, in the forests and everything, that create the runoff that leaks out slowly and fills the rivers and then fills the reservoirs on the rim and everything like that. They feel that their water has left them. And what they have done is in the state constitution, there's a provision that allows them to negotiate in the future. It's called the area of origin concept. That if and when they do need water for their economy, they have reserved rights to try and figure out how much they need and figure a way to get that back. It hasn't been tested very much in the courts because they haven't grown as much as they anticipated, and they've been doing okay in meeting their local needs, whether it's Sonora or Auburn or Placerville or Grass Valley, Nevada City. Actually, Nevada City has a very good water supply. They develop their own locally. They're one of the oldest also in terms of a water district. It's kind of ironic. They're really not suited very much for crops, but they did manage to organize very early on with some smart people to build a water district that serves mostly local needs. I think they have apple orchards and some crops up there, but in any event, area of origin. And so that's kind of what the compact was about. Hey, we got most of the mountains and developed most of the water for the Colorado River. We needed, so they divided it up in the compact to make sure that they did have the opportunity to divert some of that water, and that's what happens over in Colorado. So Lake Mead and Lake Powell, huge reservoirs, absolutely gigantic, holds practically a year's and a half's worth of a natural runoff together in those two giant reservoirs. But what we have in the last 15 years or so, and this is a big area of contention right now with California and the rest of the Colorado states using the Colorado River states. Meade and Powell have benchmarks, and they're not supposed to deliver water to certain areas based on those benchmarks. The first people that get cut are Nevada and Arizona, and they're not very happy about that. Because what turns out is that when the compact was put together back in the early 20th century or mid 20th century after several court decisions, it was a wet period. And it turns out that the Colorado now might be in a dry period, and they base the allocations on wet. So the Colorado compact is suspect right now in terms of the states might want to open it up. And that's why I say it's important. It's one of the conditions and issues that we'll need to deal with in California's new uncertain water future, is that Colorado is really heating up, if you don't mind that pun, because Meade and Powell are both low. In fact, City of Las Vegas, Las Vegas Valley Water District, and the Southern Nevada Water Authority are drilling like crazy as we speak. They're within a few hundred yards, I think, of connecting a new tunnel. Because what they did was years ago is, based on the height of Lake Mead, they have a series of tunnels to take their drinking water out to deliver it to Las Vegas. The reservoir is now down to the top of the last tunnel. So they're building another one down deeper. And they're scrambling to get it done, because if we have another dry year, they could literally be running out of the capacity to get any water. I mean, they could throw temporary pumps, I suppose, and try to fill it up that way, but that would be awful expensive. So Nevada and the city of Las Vegas are scrambling. So we're in a period where we're finding out that a lot of the things that we designed for in terms of water supplies, well, we were pretty lucky and fortunate when they were built and designed, and then we apportioned the water based on those years of building and the design that they came up with to capture that water. But it turns out we may not be getting the water that we thought because of natural cycles of drought, and water years that are normal or wet are not as frequent as perhaps they were when those projects were built. And here is the differences. A lot of people think of the Colorado as just this giant river serving all the 7 western states that it serves, and it's in between the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. And in fact, in the last 10 years, it's been right where the San Joaquin usually is. It's only been delivering about 10 million acre-feet. So that big area served by that long river actually doesn't generate near as much water, nowhere near what the Sacramento River does, and now it's down around where the San Joaquin is. What we don't know yet is where we are with the San Joaquin in terms of its capabilities, because we don't know how long this drought that we're in is going to last. So it might have to drop the numbers in terms of what it could deliver, what its capacity is over the long term. So, but in any event, the Colorado is in trouble, and that affects California's water pretty seriously. Next project, Central Valley Project. This is where the Bureau of Reclamation got real busy, and the rest of the state, after their experience in Southern California, they have the reclamation law. It's their desire and design to help out California and develop its rich Central Valley. And they built a series of dams and projects to be able to do that. And the most important was first Lake Shasta, but then later Folsom Reservoir on the American River. That's this stub right here. And the Trinity diversion, Lewiston up here, is a tributary of the Klamath River. And they built a storage reservoir here that goes through a tunnel that then feeds in down near Redding that supplements the Central Valley project up there. So what happened was, of course, is California had a master plan on how to meet the needs of the future of California in terms of water. And it was a state water plan that was developed in the 1930s. And what was happening in the 1930s? The Great Depression. No money. Couldn't sell bonds. Couldn't do anything. And the federal government was trying to do everything and anything, right? Of course, obviously, President Roosevelt was already in office and thinking about the public works projects and how to get people back to work. And that's what helped kick it off. The government said, state of California will help. We'll come in and we'll use the printing power of the federal government to finance developing these projects. And the Central Valley project was pretty high on the list. We were already seeing the migration from Oklahoma. We had a lot of fruit tramps, they called them, as well as people who were picking cotton on the west side. And so this area was actually doing fairly well, but it was running out of water for two reasons. Number one, the variability, once again, in the Sierras, and there weren't any rim dams of any consequence at that time. So all of the fruit growing areas were at the whim of the rivers. So if it was a short year like this year, the river might run until the 1st of March, and it was one and done. You couldn't have any water later in the year to try and keep your fruit growing. You had to rely then on groundwater. Remember I'd said on the last session, the big development at the turn of the 20th century also was the development of the deep well turbine pump. So these guys started turning on their pumps in the 1930s, and what did they do? They just sucked the groundwater down to practically nothing in some areas. We're running out of water, and the government said, "Well, that's another reason why I need to come in here and build a project for you. We'll build these rim dams, and we'll deliver this water from Northern California, and we'll replace your groundwater." And that was the purpose of the Central Valley project, was to replenish the groundwater. Not to bring in new lands and develop new agriculture, which ultimately happened, but to replace the water that was lost as a result of over-pumping in the Central Valley. Less so in the Sacramento Valley. And in fact, the issue mostly for the Sacramento Valley was really flood control. That area was inundated often by the raging rivers, including the Sacramento. You saw how much more powerful it is, 38 million acre feet a year, and when it goes into flood, it went into flood. I mean, we've had floods, you may have read in the papers or heard, Sacramento went under in the 1860s. I mean, they had to literally pick the town up and rebuild it. Marysville, Yuba City frequently got inundated, just totally wiped out. The ground is really flat. In fact, that's why they grow rice up there. It's heavy clay soils. Essentially, it was a giant wetland, is what the Sacramento Valley is. And in fact, that's one of the things that they continue to tout today is one of the functions of the Sacramento Valley is the rice growing areas serve as a waterfowl habitat. Whatever the rice that's left over or the straw or whatever, straw will decompose and allow for bugs and things to grow in. And so the ducks love the rice. They love the critters that grow on the bottom of the rice growing areas. So it is a very important function for them to support the Pacific Flyway, especially for migrating ducks. Egrets and herons and all the other critters too. In fact, they have big days up now. Like we had hat days. They have blue heron days up there. Everybody go out and go see the blue herons that have come in. Big flocks of these huge blue and gray birds. So the Central Valley Project was a cornerstone then of water development in California. The projects then were, once again, Shasta and Trinity. This is called the Tehama-Colusa Canal. Much like the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, that is drier and is made up of lighter textured soils up there, and they grow some of the same things. In fact, they're struggling right now the same as we are. They're on a zero farm allocation, and they have a lot of almonds on the west side, Glen, Colusa County. And so they're going to be trying moving some groundwater around and things to save theirs as well. This was the Folsom South Canal. It went down here, and it was one that was actually one of the last parts of the Central Valley Project and was stopped for the lack of funds and contractors. One of the things that people don't understand about the federal government and reclamation law is not only do you have to pay for the water to pay for the project, pay for the capital for the project. There's a lot of controversy about whether we should be paying the interest on that, and you'll see that a lot in the blogs or from the environmental community in some cases, that they're getting these projects, this water is subsidized. The subsidy is the interest on the bonds that were sold, not the bond capital costs. These guys are paying the capital costs, and in fact, the capital costs actually continue to grow. It doesn't seem to be reducing because they add new features onto the Central Valley Project, either by law or by executive decision under what they think then is the law. And it may include wetland restoration projects. It might include new construction to repair or rebuild. That gets put back onto the capital costs, and so it's kind of a moving target. So they have contracts right now. They're 25-year contracts in many instances. They started out as 40-year contracts, and you had to sign a contract to get the water. And when these people first saw those contracts and found out how much the water was going to cost, a lot of them didn't want to sign up because their water was still a lot cheaper locally, either pumping it or by their local surface source than the federal water was. And so it's the areas that were really starved that had no water that ended up signing some of the contracts, and that's why it didn't actually serve its original function. It didn't do a good enough job of replacing the groundwater. We still ended up with groundwater problems, and I'll talk about that in the last session more about groundwater overdraft, because a lot of the people that the federal government had to pay for the project, they were building it. So they had to have people sign up. So people signed up in new areas in some cases who had no groundwater or had no surface water rights. So that's why it didn't quite do what it was originally intended to do, including this area, the San Luis area. The San Luis unit is the area that gets the water from Tracy at the pumps in the Delta, runs down the west side, terminates with the original Delta-Mendota Canal in Mendota Pool, and exchanged water for these guys over here. This is the Friant unit. It goes up into Madera. That's the Madera Canal. It's the Friant Canal. It goes all the way to Arvin Edison Water District near Bakersfield. Serves this area out in here. This unit then irrigated the west side. And then it got tied in over here, of course, at San Luis Reservoir. And when San Luis Reservoir was added as the state water project, those became joint use facilities from here and parallel to the Delta-Mendota Canal. You drive over 152, you drive over two large canals west of Los Banos. One is the original Central Valley Project Delta-Mendota Delta unit. The other is the San Luis Canal, and the California Aqueduct takes over at Kettleman City and goes all the way then and ties down into Southern California. So this is the Central Valley Project. Federal project, had to sign a contract, have to pay for the water, have to pay the capital back on the construction. State water project. Those are the pumps down in the Tehachapi's. If you look from the right from as you're going over I-5, you see those big son of a guns. A couple of years ago, they had a shortage of workers here, and an alarm went off. One of those tubes started to backflow, and the backflow prevention devices that they had on there were failing. We almost lost the pumping plant, and it was due to a shortage of qualified workers. The state of California, if you know anybody who can get certificated in operating control systems, whether it's electrical systems or mechanical, they're still looking for new people. They can't keep up with the demand statewide because of succession. Those of us that are getting a little older have retired, and there's not enough qualified people coming through training to be able to run these kinds of systems, and so they were short operators. Fortunately, a supervisor did find it, caught it in time, went through the procedures for stopping it, but Los Angeles would have been without that water for some time if that had it failed. So that lifts it up all the way over to Tehachapi's and gets over to Pyramid Lake and Castaic, the two you see on either side of I-5 as you're driving over the top. Pyramid is the one that's notched up there on the high side. Castaic is over on the left side as you get into the Santa Clarita Valley near Valencia. So the State Water Project didn't come along, though, until 1960. Remember, the state was broke for a long time, and we're broke again. But in 1960, Pat Brown did sell the bonds after a very, very strong political fight. There were people who did not want to pay for this either. They did not want to sign contracts, and they did not want to. So he used some political arm twisting. We talked about the Raker Act with San Francisco and in Washington, D.C. It was not that easy a deal for them to get that through, but they did. And these are the components. Here's the American River where Folsom Dam is, but then up here on the Feather River, which has a fairly good-sized watershed up here. Remember the beginning slide about where the snow and the high rainfall was? It was up here and up in the Shasta, and then out here over on the Coast Range with a couple of isolated spots here and even one down on the top up there, over 100 inches. That's Oroville and the Thermalito Afterbay and all that project up there around Yuba City, Marysville, Chico, all that territory up there, the Feather River. So that's the source. That watershed is the source for the State Water Project. And the biggest contractors are Kern County Water Agency and the Southern California Water Agencies, then the Bay Area. And I'll show you the breakdown in the next section. So that's the State Water Project. It then includes the aqueduct going over the Tehachapi's, the stub going to Santa Barbara, the stub going through Livermore into the South Bay, and then on the San Luis Reservoir, there's a tunnel on the backside that takes water into Santa Clara Water District in the Silicon Valley. Now, they are both a federal contractor and a state water contractor to meet the needs of the Silicon Valley. So now, of course, they're going to be on the list for hardship water, but their current allocation of water out of the San Luis Reservoir is 0-0 for both of the projects right now, till we figure out how much the hardship is. There was a question I saw. No? Okay, keep moving. Bay Delta. We have the Colorado is in crisis. Looking at how hard it can meet its commitments. This is the way the Delta services the state. I mentioned that the Bay Area gets water from the Delta, not only from the State Water Project, but then the Hetch Hetchy and the McCollum. So 33% of their water comes either bypasses the Delta or out of the Delta itself. Kern County, 23% down here. That's their State Water Project water that they signed a contract for. Very expensive water. That was water, I believe, that sold out of Kern County a few weeks ago. Entitlement in an area that was changing, going from permanent crops to back to natural habitat. It was uneconomical to farm. I think it sold the entitlement, not the water, the contract entitlement for $2,200 an acre foot. And some ag guys bought some of that expensive water. I think the second tier was closer to $1,500. So there were multiple bids for pieces of the water contract. And that's unheard of in California water. In years past, water on the open market, there is an open market that you can buy water, and sometimes it's Northern California agencies that sell water because they're in a surplus because there's so much wetter up here. And you got to get it through the Delta, and by the time it would go delivered, it was between $500 and $7 an acre foot on the spot market. I couldn't imagine what it's going to be this year, if there is any. I don't think they're going to be able to do it because they're just as bad off this year as we are. Southern California, 30% of their water comes from some regions are up to 100% dependent on the Delta. 22 million residents rely on Delta water. It supplies Bay Area, Central Valley, and Southern California. Irrigates 45% of the fruits and vegetables produced in the U.S. A lot of people don't realize how important the Central Valley is to the economy of the United States in terms of that productivity. We talked about in the first session the problem with transporting produce, and that we had an economic advantage at some time because of the lack of rot. 80% of the state's commercial fishery species live in or migrate through the Bay Delta. Live in or migrate through. And that's a big difference. The migrate through are predominantly the salmon. The live-in are the Delta smelt, the longfin smelt, Sacramento, oh boy, squawfish. It's a indigenous species. The green sturgeon. There are a number of indigenous species, and a number of them are on the endangered species list. Delta smelt, longfin smelt, and sturgeon. Habitat for 500 species, including the 5. I missed one. And the 500 species, I think that includes terrestrial, because the delta is also a habitat for things like butterflies and birds as well. I think we have the tricolored blackbird, I think the red-winged blackbird. Okay, where does the water go out through the delta? That's kind of a pretty picture, isn't it? Stockton, Sacramento, looking all the way up, see Lassen. I guess maybe this must be Shasta, or that's Shasta. Isn't that beautiful? Quite a shot. I think it's a rastered image. That's an image that has been shot and then been computer aided, yes. So I think it was the satellite image. Actually, it might have been a low-level flight now that I think about it. So it's an airplane at a certain height that then shoots off with a wide-angle lens and takes that in, and then it's 3D'd on the computer. So in the Delta only uses 6% of the flow that comes into it. Bay Area uses 18% of the ocean gets 76% of the outflow. And of course, this is the area of controversy right here. What is necessary to get out of the Delta to support both indigenous species as well as migrating species like the salmon? They're not going to get that this year. Southern California and Central Valley divert 18% of their water from this area. And this is how they do it. Water starts at Lake Shasta and Folsom Lake and Oroville, Feather River, goes into the Sacramento River, works its way down. There's some cross-channel gates and some facilities in the delta that changes the flow patterns of where it can go, and it's try to manage it so it will have minimum impacts on migrating salmon and things like that. They have now all kinds of stuff to stop the salmon from going on this branch, and it has to do with channel depth and capability to move the water. The channels are silted up in many cases. Remember, in the first session we talked about mining. The delta channels in a lot of the river aren't very deep in many places because a lot of silt and stuff settled out in the bottom. So it's quite difficult to push the water all the way through. But these are the paths that it takes. And then you go to Tracy, and there's 2 pumping plants. One was this federal Central Valley project that's been there the longest, and the other was the State Water Project then that was added after the State Water Project was built in the 60s. And the pumps suck water from here, and this is called Clifton Court Forebay right here. This is Discovery Bay, which is a water-based community, bunch of houses with all kinds of water on everybody's backyard or front yard. There's Tracy. This area is developing, by the way. If you ever drive up here, you'll see they're building Highway 4 into a 6-laner between Antioch, Oakley, Brentwood, all the way down to Tracy. It stopped in the financial crisis because some of it was being built by a local developer down here. That's the way it has to move, through the delta to get to the pumps. And the big issue with that flow pattern is that since the flow from the Sacramento used to go through all those channels and tie in with the Sacramento River, it sometimes reverses the flow. And so if you're a fish who wants to go here and you're following the flow, it goes down here instead. And that's the big problem at the pumps, is that they have salvage facilities at both the state and federal projects constantly operating fish management facilities to recapture especially the endangered species, pick them up, and then they truck them out and drop them someplace where they think they can survive. Unfortunately for the fish, even some fish are pretty smart. Striped bass is one that is not indigenous. It came from the Hudson River, was imported into the Delta in the late 1800s, early 1900s as a sport fish. and it has thrived in the delta, and it loves to eat juvenile salmon. So when they dump them, there's a striped bass sitting there waiting for lunch. One of the big problems today is in managing fisheries. That's one of the controversies, and we'll talk about in the conditions and issues section, is how do you manage the delta and the water system with competing goals, water supply reliability and the ecosystem that it supports. Bay Delta is the critical hub. It's the point of no return. The Colorado is more of a water supply issue from the standpoint that it affects the state from the standpoint if we lose more of the Colorado River water, where's Los Angeles and Southern California going to go for the rest of that supply? Right up north. Right? We talked about subsidence. This is a different kind of subsidence. This is surface subsidence. Mentioned that when we have groundwater systems that have clays down deep, relatively deep, 500 feet in western Fresno County, 350 in Madera County, only 200 feet up in Stanislaus County. This is surface subsidence, and it has to do with the soils. What the islands used to be was a giant wetland. And a wetland is made up of what? Tules and cattails, or whatever you want to call them, all the bulrushes, all those species of wetland swamp-type plants, and they died over and over and over again, and the new plants grew up on the top. And what that created was a peat soil. And peat soil will do two things. It'll blow away, well, three things. It'll blow away, it'll catch on fire and burn, and that they use that in England and Scotland, right, for fuel for many places. Or it will be cooked away by the growth of plants that are not native. The tules were so prolific that they kept adding. You bring in other crops, whether it's alfalfa or asparagus or whatever it is that they're growing there, corn. I might remember this part of the delta over here, part of southern Solano County, I think this is it right here, in this area, set a world record for bushels of corn per acre at one time. It beat every state in the union and every place in the world. So they've grown corn out here as well. This is sinking then for a couple of reasons. Then the peat is burning off and dropping. But then, well, yeah, it's the peat. And so this now is, there are these levees that are around all of these channels. If you stand at the bottom down here, one of these low spots, you're looking up, and the levee's up there, and the water level on the other side of the levee is only about 3 feet below the top of the levee. So there's just tremendous water pressure on the other side of the levee, and that threatens the interior of the delta day in and day out. And Roberts Island is this one here. For no reason at all, back in 2005, it did break and flooded that whole island, and that's the one where the McCollum Aqueduct went through, gas line, the railroad, maybe it's further south. I'm looking for Highway 4. I know it cuts right through here because there's Discovery Bay, goes over to Stockton. So this area then has a subsidence problem and levees that are unstable. They were built back in the late 1800s in some cases so that under the Swamp and Overflow Lands Act, the federal government was allowing people to homestead this kind of an area. So what they do, they threw up levees and started irrigating. You know how they irrigate? They turn the pumps off. They don't need to pump the water out to spray it on. They can, but all they have to do is they have drainage ditches around the edges of the islands and through the islands, and the water seeps in because of all that pressure. And if they want to irrigate, it's called sub-irrigation in some places. They turn the pump off and the water rises from all that pressure into the root zone of the plants. It's one of the uniquest irrigation methods that I know of. I think the Dutch use it too a little bit. So we got a problem. Running out of time. Delta fisheries decline. That's the other big thing going on with the delta risks. Not only do we have delta smelt that has decreased in its population for a variety of reasons, predation, loss of habitat, invasive species. They're the critters that are not native to the area, including in the food chain. Corbicula, there's a clam up there that clarifies the water. It is a filter feeder. And it makes it so clear that the predators can see the usual fish that used to live in there in cloudy water. Delta smelt is one of those. Flooding, Jones Tract, there it broke. 2004, excuse me. And it's seismically unstable. There's a bunch of faults that run just to the west of it and right through it. So, climate change is another variability. Magnitude of the quake will cause liquefaction of those levees, and that's all it will take is one little quake, groundwater. Why don't we save that for the next time? Because I think groundwater is pretty important to the San Joaquin Valley, but I wanted to give you a flavor of the two big challenges for California's water in terms of surface water is the Colorado River water and the Bay Delta system. Those were the biggies today. Questions?
Is it possible if you could go back to one of the maps of the delta and show us where the proposed tunnels are supposed to go?
Yeah? It's in the future. I think I've got a slide on that. I'll make sure that that's in there. I'd be happy to do that. I don't think that's a problem.
Two questions. One, is it RAFER or Raker Act?
Raker, R-A-K-E-R, Raker Act.
And the other question was, at the beginning you were talking about the 160-acre limit.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to recall reading a few years ago.
It's been amended. It's 960 now.
But there were still, well, people in the Westlands farm more than 960 acres.
Yeah, they sure do.
They're still,
Leasing.
they're leasing it from each other.
They're leasing it from each other. Good, very good. Ma'am, you were next.
Yes, I'm really surprised that the Sacramento River has twice the.
3 times, almost 40 million maybe. Yeah,
Has it always been that way?
yes. Isn't that scary? Ma'am,
We have such a long shoreline, would you be able to address next time the problems with the desalinization plants and why we can't use ocean water for,
preview, let's take a quick tour. I had a slide here I was going to show you. Let's see. Oh, that's subsidence. Western Madera County, that's a marker for a gas line. And that's how much it sank in about 2 years. Desal.
While he's searching for the PowerPoint, just to let you know, all of the handouts that I gave you has the PowerPoint link for next week. So
Yep, it's in there.
bring it back.
I know desal is in here someplace because it is part of the future strategies. So we'll get to it. It's power and discharge that are the big things, and siting it is a big problem. Sue, groundwater will be the next big subject because that's the big 3 I talk about are the Bay Delta, the Colorado River, and groundwater. Those, and the future is how do we integrate all of that together? That's what we'll talk about in the last session.
the deals that we have with Mexico and the Colorado River. And I've read that the water that Mexico is getting is now very poor quality. But I've also heard that we are cleaning that water up. Can you tell me anything about that?
Yes, there's the humid desalter. The Gila and some of the areas close by to the river have drainage that goes right out from the fields after it's been used, or from some cases what they have under drains, which when I remember I talked earlier about salt being in the water, you put a pipe down at the bottom and it can drain that saltier water out. And so under the treaty we did have an agreement that we would provide a certain water quality, and the humid desalter is operating right now, and so it goes direct to Mexico in terms of the water supply. I think it goes direct. It may also be dilution water. But we have an obligation and we're trying to meet that. So yes, we're trying to do a couple of things. They also have gone through and done what they call pulse flows out of the Colorado River dams, whether it's from Meade or Parker or from Havasu. And that is they shoot a whole bunch of water real hard, real fast. It does 2 things. It moves the silt out and or moves it around so that it reestablishes riparian vegetation, but it also provides water quality improvement and pulses to get it out and flush salts out of the delta, which is in Mexico. So there's a number of strategies that they're using to try and meet the treaty requirements for quality. Yeah, I think we also need an exchange agreement to help their farmers understand how to use new techniques, because we can use saltier water now as well, especially with drip tape. So there's a multitude of things that we can be and should be doing. I'm not familiar with all of them, but I can look into it. We're focusing on California, okay? Anybody else? Thank you.
Cousin says he knows you and asked me to give you his best wishes, Fred Machado.
Yeah, that's great.